Okay, chapter 12. Here we go. Chapter 12, an age of reform. It is called an age of reform because there are several reform movements taking place. Prison reform, including the reform of what are called fallen women, prostitution, women who are prostitutes, taking them to asylums, basically, right? The idea of correcting people's behavior, prison reform, making alcohol illegal. Right? The idea is you can improve people's lives by taking the temptation of alcohol away, right? Tempering their behavior, temperance. Public schools. The public school system is going to spread mostly across the North, virtually non-existent in the South. So not only do you have slaves who are 90% illiterate, but a bulk of the poor white population in the South, also illiterate, also without education. One of the main things, though, for education is the spread of public education is in some ways a response to Catholic schools opening up, right? The Irish Catholic immigration of the 1840s and the idea that a public school system will, help to maintain sort of a Protestant, secular or elite Protestant leading nation. The main thing, movements like communes, you have the Mormons who are going to Salt Lake City, various reform movements, right? The main thing that we need to take away from this, in my opinion, the one I focus on, because it relates to slavery, which is a main issue in this class, and it relates to the Whig Party, right over here, the Whigs, is the idea of perfectionism, which replaces Calvinist predestination, right? Sinners can themselves, but could also remake the world, right? They could become more perfect, perfectionism. They could pursue happiness, right? The idea in the Declaration of Independence, the pursuit of happiness, that everyone has the right to recognize their full potential. We can actually help people better than, right? And a more perfect union, which in every American working to improve themselves this way, the nation becomes more perfect, which is what the Constitution asks for, right? The Constitution was written opening with "we the people" in order to form a more perfect union, right? Not perfect, but striving for perfection each generation. The burned over districts. The burned over districts are a part of New York where the Erie Canal is built in 1825. The Erie Canal is completed. That is an east to west water route, man-made water route, which is going to bring a whole section of the country which had previously not really engaged in a market economy into a market economy. People growing crops to sell. People buying and selling more than they are acting as subsistence farmers, right? Just growing their own food or whatever. It's going to tie more people to this market, a market which is a boom and bust, right? We live in a boom and bust economy. Economy is good at times and not so good at times. It's a free, theoretically, or people say it's a free market economy. That's debatable, but this is going to create a lot of economic changes, right? We're living in a time like that where we're living in a time where America used to have lots of industrial jobs and we don't, and wages are stagnant, right? The minimum wage hasn't gone up. There's a lot of confusing economic situations right now, which create a lot of uncertainty. As a result, people are going to really cling to the ideas of the Second Great Awakening, right up here, the Second Great Awakening, right? Not just perfectionism, but just it's really an evangelical Christian movement. It's similar to, I guess, but not in the same vein as, evangelical preachers today. Some similar in tactics, but not as, I would say not as fundamentally across the board conservative. We could say that about a lot of the Christian leadership in this country today, but they were a little more nuanced back then. They did support the idea of legislating morality. I'm skipping right? This idea of legislating morality, temperance, making alcohol illegal. But the burned over districts really embraced this evangelical thing because they were in a confusing economic time. There was a lot of uncertainty. In those situations, people usually try to find answers, and some people find answers through God. And that's what these folks did. So that's why that's an important element of this. The Mormons are also in this time period, right? The Mormons are going to move to Salt Lake City. So you have a lot of different religious movements, communes, but you have some political and social movements like temperance, eliminating the use of alcohol, right? In America, as Foner says, the consumption of alcohol per person had peaked in 1830 at 7 gallons per year. That's a lot, right? That's a lot. And there was no drinking age. There was no, they didn't, basically, Americans used to drink a lot. Remember the Whiskey Rebellion. Lots of people used to distill their own alcohol, including the first president, George Washington. He probably didn't actually do a lot of the work. I'd imagine he had some slaves and some overseers and such. So the temperance movement is a movement to ban alcohol. Initially, this starts as a moral movement, legislating morality. If we can remove alcohol from people's lives, they'll become more productive for our economy. They'll see this depiction in the background of a husband who comes home probably drunk. He may very well have spent the entire week's pay at a bar. This happens today. This happens during the California Gold Rush, right? Where you have these boom towns where the boarding houses and the brothels and the saloons end up being the small business owners that really make money. Most of the gold that the average person finds, you find a piece of gold, you get some money for it, and you would immediately start spending it on alcohol or whatever. You party, right? So this is a problem. It's also it's seen as a problem by employers. It's seen as a problem by everybody, or by lots of folks, right? So it initially starts as, I'm sure there was some xenophobic, anti-foreign, right? The Irish Catholics who are stereotyped as drinking a lot. A lot of immigrants would come here and would work 12, 14-hour days, and they would go to saloons afterwards. They're probably in pain. They're probably self-medicating. A lot of times they would discuss the idea of organizing as a group, unionizing, right? And so later on, and so there's some elements of xenophobia, but later on, when the prohibition actually makes alcohol illegal, right? The temperance movement starts in 1826. Prohibition comes 94 years later, and it's really a result of World War I. There's an anti-immigration fever as a result of World War I, and it's seen as a way to lash out at immigrants in their ethnic neighborhoods and their saloons. It's a way to lash out at Germans who the Americans went to war with, like German Americans, Pabst, Anheuser-Busch, right, beer makers. And so, but in this situation, it's really primarily about this idea of perfectionism, right? And the idea that government, the Whigs embrace this idea that government can legislate morality. Government can do things, including legislate morality, in order to improve people's lives. Like the government can build a foundation upon which we can recognize our pursuit of happiness. So eliminate alcohol, take away that temptation, right? Reform prisons, right? End slavery. That's the big one. We'll get to that later. Universal education, universal public education by 1860, right? There's universal tax-supported public education. The transportation is supporting infrastructure, right? Building colleges, building schools, building roads, these things we think of. The Whig Party would view that as putting in place the basic foundation for everybody to recognize their own pursuit of happiness, their own worth in life, basically, right? So that's the big thing. And so along with that, the main reform movement we focus on, along with that, is slavery, ending slavery, right? Because not only are there 4 million slaves nearly in 1860 who cannot pursue happiness, they cannot recognize their full potential, regardless of how hard they work, regardless of what kind of abilities they may have or they may be able to acquire at one of these schools. They are shut out of this legally, right? They are legally prevented from this idea of a declaration and all these other things that the Whig Party really embraces. And so they're a big government party, right? A big government party, you would say. I mean, even more so than the Democrats are today in some ways, because the Whig Party actually supports legislating morality, which drinking or alcohol, what today we would consider things like abortion or marijuana use, stuff like that. So So slavery is seen as really an issue the government needs to tackle. We need to end slavery so that the slaves can recognize their full potential. We need to end this sort of stain on American fabric that is forcibly keeping people from recognizing their full potential. Right? White Southerners, poor whites don't have slaves. Poor whites, the Northerners would say this, that Southern society in general is really limited and not really advancing the way that they want the country to advance, industrializing, market economy, a more global economy, and then utilizing this expansion and this wealth for infrastructure, schools, roads, a diverse economy, including railroads and mining and all these things, right? All of these things. So yeah, that's the main thing: perfectionism, the Second Great Awakening, and the abolition movement really is influenced by this a lot. And the Whig Party has a lot of abolitionists in it who are going to eventually become Republicans. Was a member of the Whig Party. He was elected to Congress in the 1840s as a member of the Whig Party. And he was in Congress during the Mexican-American War, which we will discuss in a little bit. So this abolition group, it's a crusade against slavery, to abolish slavery, abolition, right? There are white abolitionists, there are black abolitionists. White abolitionists include folks in the American Colonization Society who support repatriation of freeing slaves and then having them move back to Africa, not where they were from necessarily, but to this colony established in West Africa called Liberia. Liberty, right? It's named after Liberty. Its capital, Monrovia, is named after President James Monroe because he was president in the late 18 teens and 1820s when this was established. And you also have next to Liberia, Sierra Leone, which the British had already established for slaves who were loyal to the British during the Revolution. So you have these places and this idea that, okay, we'll free the slaves and then they can go back to Africa, even though they're not really from there. Most of them are born here now. Most of them are born speaking English. They pray to a Christian God. They don't identify as African, right? This is already happening now. I mean, this idea is in our own time is definitely not a consideration at all, right? There's really no connection. You can see it you can hear it in music, and there's elements, cultural elements that you can look at and trace to West African roots, but African Americans see themselves as American first and foremost, right? Are very, so this idea is somewhat it would be considered racist, right? Excuse me. Not just, okay, we're freeing the slaves, fine, but the idea that they are not allowed to remain in America and be included in some sort of multi-ethnic democracy, right? So you're still sort of affirming the idea that whites and blacks or white people or non-white, we have Asians, Latinos, other groups, that they're not meant to function as a society together, possibly that they're not equal to whites, right? This sort of white supremacist idea. There are abolitionists who by our own standards today would be considered white supremacists. Lincoln has said many things in his life that would be considered white supremacist. If you look at the Lincoln-Douglas debate in Voices of Freedom in chapter 13, you'll see that. William Lloyd Garrison, another abolitionist, and also says some stuff that we would disagree with, or we should, I guess, published a newspaper called The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper. These are very influential, like the Liberator's influential. These are influential people, including especially the black abolitionists. They are not a majority of the country. Most Americans are not abolitionists. Most Americans, even in the North, who don't own any slaves, are very what we would consider white supremacist, right? They are not necessarily opposed to slavery because they care about black people. They're opposed to slavery because they see land in the West that's going to open up. They want to be able to move there and homestead, have their own small farms. They don't want slave owners moving in, buying up all the good land and working it with slaves, right? 90% of all immigrants, 90%, remember we talked about this, of all immigrants end up in the North in the 1840s and 1850s, right? Because there are not any real jobs in the South because they're mostly agricultural and they're mostly worked by slaves. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, very important, published in, it was actually, it ran as a serial a series of stories in a newspaper and was eventually published as a book. And I want to say 1851 or 1852. Ends up selling something like 3 million copies, which is massive at that point in time. There are about 20 million, 23 million people in the North. There are about 9 million white Southerners, right? So there's 35 million free Americans, few million slaves. So for 3 million copies, that's like 10% of the population. That does not include those who bought it, read it, and then shared it with others, like books that got passed around. Kind of like you would share an illegally downloaded episode of Game of Thrones, right? There's no real way to accurately gather that. So, but 3 million copies, this is a substantial book. It paints slavery in a very negative light. That is why the actual phrase Uncle Tom's Cabin, the term Uncle Tom, is used to describe an African-American. It's a derogatory term used to describe an African-American who is seen as not advancing the cause of African-Americans in America, right? If you for example, if you're an African-American who makes critical comments about hip hop or about welfare or things that we might identify with, pockets of the country with a large or visible African-American population, right? So Uncle Tom's Cabin. When Abraham Lincoln is president and meets Harriet Beecher Stowe, the Civil War has already begun, and he actually says to her, hey, there's that little lady that started the war, right? Because this book, 3 million copies that are sold almost entirely in the North. This book is virtually impossible to find in the South. Like it's like trying to find a copy of Mein Kampf in Germany today, which was Hitler's book. It's not, and you're not allowed to have it, right? It's almost like a McCarthy witch hunt, right? Where if you were an abolitionist in the South, you had to be very, very quiet about it, like the Grimke sisters, who we're going to be reading in chapter 12. So white abolitionists, publishing, writing books, talking about, okay, let's free folks and get them out of here, right? Kind of like, good intentions, they would think. Black abolitionists, much more important in certain ways because a lot of them were former slaves. They're really dispelling a lot of myths about slaves and African Americans in general being inferior to whites, intellectually inferior. Frederick Douglass, this gentleman who's depicted here, Frederick Douglass with 2 S's, really dispels that myth. Very articulate, very imposing, great speaker, runaway slave from Maryland, just becomes a very influential person. When Lincoln is president, he is going to have be one of the primary figures that pushes for emancipation, ending slavery, pushes for enlisting black troops, really tries to pull Lincoln in the direction of ending slavery, which Lincoln did not want to do at the start of the war. And then you can also read Frederick Douglass in chapter 12 next to the Grimke sisters. We are not going to read Frederick Douglass, though. We're reading the Grimke sisters because of this last part here, the origins of feminism. Feminism, out of all these reform movements, you have reforming prisons, reforming education. You have the abolition movement, right? And through abolition, through advocating for the end of slavery, a lot of women, these are mostly native-born Protestant white women. They're upper class, privileged women, something like Abigail Adams, right? Of nearly a century earlier, 75 years earlier, they start to see in slavery their own oppression as women, right? And this is, think about this when you're comparing, for your 5th response, comparing the Grimke sisters relating slavery to feminism with the women in SNCC relating the civil rights movement to feminism. Right, and in the civil rights movement, the women in SNCC are really a part of what's called second wave feminism. This movement here on this slide is first wave feminism, which is dated as going from 1848 roughly to 1920. 1848 being when this group of women, some of these women, get together at Seneca Falls and issue a declaration of sentiments. They call for suffrage, which is the vote, education, women's access to education, women's access to own property, and women's access to work, wages, right? Similar, I mean, there's still issues addressed by folks called so-called feminists, dealing with wages, equal pay, education, equal access to education, particularly when it comes to the sciences. This idea that women are not scientifically inclined, right? And which, you know, if you go back, even when women are allowed to go to college, a lot of these women went to college, but the idea was you go to college so that you can learn to speak French and you can read Shakespeare, so that you're a good wife and you're entertaining at dinner parties. Seriously. And this is something that lasts into the 1950s and early 60s. So I have a phone call. Okay. And so they issued this Declaration of Sentiments. And then it was to say the dichotomy, let's read this bottom quote here. This is from Foner. The dichotomy between freedom and slavery powerfully shaped early feminists' political language, right? And so this is important. This is where you get Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Abolitionists, many of them supported temperance too, banning alcohol, which you could argue was kind of a feminist issue at the time, because a lot of men, husbands, were guilty of domestic violence. And these are crimes that were perpetuated under the influence, right? Up to and including marital rape, which, you know, the sexual assault of one's wife, of one's spouse, with husbands coming home under the influence, right? This is a time and place very different from ours in some ways. So yeah, that's basically it. So remember this though. Yeah, so first wave feminism, 1848 ends in 1920. Why? Because women are allowed to vote in 1920. And that's when they really sort of disband, and they're not really sure what their goals are after that, right? Where do you go from that? We have the vote, we're allowed to, you know, so, and the second wave feminism really comes about in the 50s, 1960s really, right? The big mark of second wave feminism is seen as 1968, so 120 years later after this. 1968 at the Atlantic City Miss America pageant protest, where they did not burn bras, although people say they were bra burners. They couldn't burn anything because they were at the Atlantic City boardwalk, and you can't have open fire at a boardwalk, so it's a myth. Anyways, I'm going to stop there, and we're going to do a separate episode for chapter 13, for chapter 13. That's chapter 12. Yeah. Let's do a quiz on this now. Awesome. 5-question quiz, extra credit. Sorry I missed class today.